Hello, a warm welcome everyone. This thing you've probably heard from Christians, there are over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. It is one of the most abundant and documented things in history. You've heard it before, I'm sure. I ran into a Christian again the other day on Sunday, saying exactly the same thing. There are just an abundance of text. There's so many. They're just voluminous scribes just writing down and reporting on Jesus and so on and so forth. Actually, no, it's not that. It's not that simple. And just because there are, after a certain period of time, many scribes across the Near East and so on, Mediterranean into Europe, writing down the New Testament, it does not mean that the foundations of the Christian faith are based on solid history, on firm ground. No. Actually, what we find is this quantity over a quality argument is not, it doesn't stand up. The historicity of people, like Homer's Iliad and Odysseus and so on, Hercules, the Bhagavad Gita and the numerous mythological deities in those books, Achilles and the Trojan Wars and so on. There are many Greek pieces of archaeology and Greek texts that attest to these individuals, but they are not necessarily real people. Same can be said for the Jesus of Nazareth and the gospel stories. As I've been through already, there is not an abundance of early attestation or Christian texts at all. There are only a few fragments before 300 and certain pieces of manuscripts, but really only about 8 or 9 before we get to the 300s and the early 300s, when we begin to see more of a manuscript output, with the Vaticanus and the Sinaiticus being the two first full manuscripts we have. There are textual variants, and we will quickly go into that in a little bit. Many inconsistencies. The argument itself is based on circular reasoning. We're using the New Testament to date or to prove the New Testament. This is not valid reasoning. There are no attestations outside of the New Testament until we get to the 2nd century, and I will be explaining in the future about how they're not really good attestations at all from our pagan authors, Romans, and so on. So there are a myriad problems with just saying that. The anonymous authorship question as well. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John we don't even know if they're really real characters. They're really common names at the time. The Gospels themselves were written in Greek and a long way away from Judea, with a Greek pen, with Greek allusions, stylistics, grammatical grammatical styles that just show us that they are far more Greek words, chiasmus and so on. And so it's not good evidence actually just saying, well, look at the quantity of texts. If they come after 500 or 600, what does that really mean? It just means that Christianity was very popular. That's it. So I'm going to just quickly quote from the book again by Matthew Britt and Jaron Wingo, Christ Before Jesus, Evidence for a 2nd Century Origins of Jesus. Just to express a little more of this manuscript problem we have. So most of these manuscripts, the New Testament manuscripts, come from the 4th century or later, and that's really where the hundreds of texts come in. In fact, our oldest full New Testament manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, are dated to around the middle of the 4th century. Even these two manuscripts don't perfectly match our current Bibles. Both have various verses missing or added. For example, Vaticanus is damaged and doesn't have 4 of the Pauline letters, and Sinaiticus has the non-canonical epistle of Barnabas and Shepherd of Hermas at the end. Even in these relatively complete manuscripts, the canon was very much still undecided. Some of the manuscripts we have might even be evidence for entirely different versions of the text we have today. The fragment, known as P69, ostensibly one of the oldest fragments of Luke, could very well be a fragment of Marcion's Gospel and has a different reading than our version of Luke. On the top of that, the manuscripts we have don't even agree with each other all the time. There are hundreds of thousands of variants, with differences as big as omissions or additions of entire verses, and as small as changing a single word or letter in the manuscripts of the New Testament. Scholar Eldon J. Epp estimated that as of 2014, there are up to 750,000 variants across the current manuscripts we have today. Peter J. Guri, another scholar writing about the New Testament, believes that when excluding spelling errors, the number of variants is in the range of 500,000. More conservative scholars, such as Bart Ehrman, estimate that the number is closer to 300,000 or 300,000 or 400,000. Regardless of the exact number, the scale of how many variants we find attests to the unreliability of the scribes transmitting the information. There are only around, this is important, 138,000 words in the Greek New Testament. So even with the low estimate of 300,000 variants, there are more than double the number of variants than there are actual words in the New Testament. So when we subtract spelling errors and grammatical changes and stuff in texts between scribes, when writing in Koine Greek, you can change the grammar often in verses, and they won't affect the meaning that much if you know Koine Greek. But if we remove simple errors in spelling and that kind of meaning change, if we take that out, there are still 300,000 variants, down from 750,000. So 350,000 again, twice the number than we have words in the New Testament. So this is a real tradition, writing tradition in flux, really fluid tradition, and this is hundreds of years after we get the story of Jesus of Nazareth. So it's extremely difficult to really ascertain a history from this kind of these kinds of texts. And also, when we go back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, what we get is extremely sparse as well. There are only fragments until the 300s. We don't know what the whole texts of those fragments were. These guys even said that there are variations of Gospels like Luke, and many of them, we would assume, came from Gnostics, like Marcion, who had a different perception of Jesus anyway. So that's basically that. When you hear the argument, but there are so many texts, there are more than any other histories or any other peoples about Jesus Christ. Well, yeah, but only hundreds of years after the supposed life of Jesus Christ, and only because Christians had won the day by that point and were becoming really powerful and had schools of ministers and priests behind them who often learned to write. So when you hear this argument, just take it with a grain of salt. And certainly think about that a bit, because we know that many old Greek texts about their gods didn't necessarily track well with actually ascertaining whether these gods existed, and they are in relative abundance as well. We find these in the ground quite often. So just saying, like and sub if you like these videos. Really trying hard to try and put something out every day. Peace and love. Yeah.